In the summer of 1973, two young black girls walked into a family planning clinic in Montgomery, Alabama. Their names were Minnie Lee and Mary Alice Relf. Minnie Lee was 14 years old. Mary Alice was only 12. Their mother, who couldn't read or write, had been told by clinic workers that her daughters needed shots. She trusted the people in white coats. She signed a form with an X, believing she was protecting her children's health. But the shots never came. Instead, both girls were taken into surgery. When they woke up, they had been sterilized. Their fallopian tubes had been cut and tied. They would never be able to have children. The procedure was permanent, irreversible, and the girls had no idea what had been done to them until much later. Their mother had no idea either. She thought she was signing a consent form for birth control shots, not surgery that would end her daughter's ability to ever become mothers. When the story broke later that year, it shocked the nation. But what shocked people even more was this: the Relf sisters were not alone. They were not even unusual. They were part of a system, a machine of medical abuse that had been running quietly for decades across the United States. Thousands of black women, poor women, disabled women, and indigenous women had been sterilized without their knowledge or true consent. In many cases, they were lied to. In others, they were coerced. In the worst cases, they were operated on while unconscious, told they were getting one procedure, and waking up to discover they could never have children again. This is the story of one of the darkest chapters in American medical history. A chapter that involves doctors who saw themselves as doing good, legislators who wrote laws to control reproduction, social workers who decided which women deserved to be mothers, and a society that looked the other way while thousands of women, most of them black, were robbed of their futures. This is the story of forced sterilization in America and how it targeted black women in the South during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And this is the story of how it was all legal. Let's go back to the beginning. To understand what happened to these women, we need to understand the ideology that made it possible. It's called eugenics. And in the early 1900s, it wasn't fringe science. It was mainstream. Eugenics is the belief that the human race can be improved by controlling who is allowed to reproduce. The idea was simple, and to many people at the time, it sounded reasonable. If you could prevent people with so-called undesirable traits from having children, you could strengthen society. You could reduce poverty, crime, and illness. You could build a better future. But here's the problem. Who gets to decide what's desirable? Who gets to decide which lives are worth creating and which should be stopped before they begin? In the United States, the answer was clear. The people making those decisions were almost always white, wealthy, and powerful. And the people targeted for sterilization were almost always poor, disabled, or not white. Eugenics became a tool of control. It became a way to stop certain groups of people from growing in number, from gaining power, from demanding equality. The movement gained momentum in the early 1900s. By 1907, Indiana had passed the first state sterilization law in the country. By the 1930s, more than 30 states had similar laws on the books. These laws allowed the government to sterilize people deemed unfit to reproduce. That included people in mental institutions, people in prisons, people labeled as feeble-minded or morally deficient. It also included people who were simply poor. The logic was brutal. If you're poor, you must be inferior. If you're inferior, you shouldn't have children. And if you can't be trusted to stop having children on your own, the state will stop you. In 1911, the U.S. Supreme Court gave its blessing to this idea. The case was called Buck versus Bell, and it involved a young woman named Carrie Buck, who had been committed to a Virginia institution. She was labeled feeble-minded, though there's no real evidence she had any intellectual disability. She had been raped and became pregnant, and her family wanted to hide the shame. So they had her committed. Then the state decided to sterilize her. Carrie fought the case all the way to the Supreme Court. She lost. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. wrote the opinion. He said, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." Carrie was sterilized. So was her daughter years later. Her daughter, by the way, made the honor roll in school before she died young. She wasn't feeble-minded at all. Buck v. Bell was never overturned. It's still technically the law of the land, and it gave states the green light to sterilize tens of thousands of people over the next several decades. By the 1970s, more than 60,000 people had been forcibly sterilized in the United States under these laws. But those are just the official numbers. The real number is almost certainly much higher, because many sterilizations weren't reported. Many weren't even recorded. They were done quietly, in the margins, in hospitals and clinics where no one was watching. Now, let's talk about the South. Because while forced sterilization happened all over the country, it took on a particular character below the Mason-Dixon line. In the South, eugenics wasn't just about controlling disability or mental illness. It was about controlling black women. It was about making sure that black families didn't grow too large, didn't demand too many resources, didn't challenge the racial hierarchy that had been in place since slavery. After World War II, the civil rights movement was growing. Black Americans were demanding equality, demanding voting rights, demanding an end to segregation, and white supremacists were terrified. They saw black population growth as a threat. They believed that if black families kept having children, they would eventually outnumber white families. They would demand more power, more representation, more control. So they looked for ways to slow it down. And one of the tools they used was sterilization. In the 1950s and 60s, doctors across the South began performing a procedure that became grimly known as the Mississippi appendectomy. It wasn't a real medical term. It was slang. It was what people called it when a black woman went into the hospital for a routine procedure, an appendectomy, a C-section, a minor surgery, and came out sterilized. She might not know it right away. She might go months or even years without realizing what had been done to her. But when she tried to get pregnant and couldn't, when she went back to the doctor and asked why, that's when she found out. Her tubes had been tied. Her uterus had been removed. She had been sterilized without her consent. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a few rogue doctors making bad decisions. It was systematic. It was policy. In some southern states, hospitals had informal quotas. Medical residents, young doctors in training, were expected to perform a certain number of sterilizations before they could graduate. Black women on welfare were seen as easy targets. They were already in the hospital, already vulnerable, already dependent on the state for support. And many of them didn't have the resources or the knowledge to fight back. Fannie Lou Hamer was one of the women who spoke out. Hamer was a civil rights activist, a sharecropper from Mississippi, who became a powerful voice in the fight for voting rights. In 1961, she went into the hospital in Sunflower County, Mississippi, to have a small uterine tumor removed. She was 44 years old. When she woke up, she discovered that the doctor had performed a complete hysterectomy. He had removed her uterus entirely. She had not consented to this. She had not been told it was going to happen. She was furious, devastated. She later said that it was so common in Mississippi that it had a name. The Mississippi Appendectomy, she called it. She said, I went in for a small knot on my stomach, and they took my womb. Hamer wasn't alone. In 1965, a study found that in some counties in the South, as many as 60% of black women of childbearing age had been sterilized. 60%. Think about that number. More than half of all black women in certain areas had been robbed of the ability to have children, and most of them didn't know it was coming. Most of them didn't have a choice. The methods varied. Sometimes doctors simply lied. They told women they were getting a different procedure. They told them the surgery was necessary to save their lives. They told them it was temporary, that it could be reversed, that they could still have children later. None of that was true. Other times, doctors used coercion. They told women on welfare that if they didn't agree to be sterilized, they would lose their benefits. They would lose their housing, their food stamps, their medical care. They were given a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Agree to the surgery or lose everything. And then there were the women who never got a choice at all. Women who were sterilized while they were unconscious, during childbirth or during another surgery. Women who signed consent forms they couldn't read, written in medical language they didn't understand. Women who trusted their doctors, trusted the system, and were betrayed. One of the most important cases to bring this issue to light was the case of the Relf sisters, the two girls I mentioned at the beginning. In 1973, their case went public, and it sparked outrage. How could this happen? How could children who hadn't even reached puberty, be sterilized without their knowledge? The answer was simple. It happened because it had been happening for decades. It happened because the system allowed it. It happened because no one was stopping it. The Relf family sued. Their lawyer was a man named Joseph Levin, who worked for the Southern Poverty Law Center. Levin argued that the sterilizations violated the girls' constitutional rights. He argued that informed consent had not been given, that the mother's signature didn't count because she couldn't read the form. He argued that the entire program, funded by the federal government through the Office of Economic Opportunity, was targeting poor and minority families. The case revealed something shocking. The federal government had been funding sterilizations through family planning programs, and there were almost no safeguards in place. Between 1970 and 1973, the government had funded between 100,000 and 150,000 sterilizations. Many of them were done on women who were poor, Black, Latina, or Native American. Many of them were done under coercion. And many of them were done on women who didn't fully understand what was being done to them. The judge in the Relf case, Gerhard Gesell, was appalled. He ruled that the government's sterilization program had been rife with abuse. He said that an indefinite number of poor people had been improperly coerced into accepting sterilization. He issued new regulations. From now on, there had to be real informed consent. Patients had to be given information in a language they understood. They had to be told that sterilization was permanent. They had to be told they could refuse without losing their benefits. And no one under the age of 21 could be sterilized with federal funds. But here's the thing. These regulations were issued in 1974. That means for decades before that, there were no such rules. For decades, doctors had been free to sterilize women without proper consent, and the government had been paying for it. The Relf sisters had been sterilized just months before the new rules were put in place. If they had walked into that clinic a year later, it might not have happened. But they didn't, and so they lost the chance to ever have children of their own. The case opened the floodgates. Other women came forward. In North Carolina, women who had been sterilized as teenagers under the state's Eugenics program began to speak out. Between 1929 and 1974, North Carolina sterilized more than 7,600 people. About 85% of them were women. About 40% were black, even though black people made up only about 25% of the state's population. Many of these women had been labeled feeble-minded or promiscuous. Many had been sterilized as teenagers, sometimes as young as 13 or 14 years old. And many didn't find out what had been done to them until years later when they tried to have children and couldn't. One woman, Elaine Riddick, was sterilized in North Carolina in 1968. She was 14 years old. She had been raped and became pregnant. And after she gave birth, a social worker decided she should be sterilized. The decision was made by a 5-person eugenics board that had never met Elaine, had never spoken to her, had never asked her what she wanted. They simply looked at her case file, saw that she was poor and black and had a child out of wedlock, and decided she was unfit to have more children. So they sterilized her. She didn't find out until she was married, years later, and tried to have more children. That's when a doctor told her what had been done. She was devastated. She said, "I felt like I had been raped again." In California, Latina women were targeted in similar ways. In the 1970s, doctors at Los Angeles County USC Medical Center sterilized dozens of Latina women without proper consent. Many of them were sterilized immediately after giving birth, while they were still in pain, still sedated, still vulnerable. Doctors would shove consent forms in front of them during labor and pressure them to sign. The forms were often in English, even though many of the women spoke only Spanish. The women didn't understand what they were signing. They thought they were agreeing to temporary birth control or to a routine procedure. They didn't realize they were agreeing to be sterilized forever. In 1975, 10 of these women sued the hospital. The case was called Madrigal vs. Quilligan. The women testified about what had been done to them. They talked about being pressured, being lied to, being sterilized without understanding what was happening. But they lost the case. The judge ruled that there was no intent to violate their rights, that the doctors had made mistakes but hadn't acted maliciously. The women got nothing. The hospital faced no consequences, and the message was clear. Even when these abuses were brought to light, even when women fought back, the system protected itself. It's important to understand that this wasn't just about individual doctors making bad choices. This was about a system that devalued certain lives, a system that saw poor women, black women, Latina women, indigenous women as problems to be solved, as burdens on society, as people who shouldn't be allowed to reproduce. This was about a society that believed at a deep level that some people were worth less than others. And that belief shaped policy. It shaped medical practice. It shaped the law. Native American women were also targeted, often in horrifying numbers. During the 1970s, the Indian Health Service, the federal agency responsible for providing health care to Native Americans, sterilized thousands of Native women, often without their full consent. A 1976 report by the Government Accountability Office found that between 1973 and 1976, the Indian Health Service had sterilized at least 3,406 Native American women. But the report only looked at 4 of the 12 IHS regions, so the real number was almost certainly much higher. Some estimates suggest that as many as 25% to 50% of Native American women of childbearing age were sterilized during the 1960s and 70s. Many of these women were pressured into signing consent forms while they were in labor, or while they were sedated, or while they were being told that their lives or their babies' lives were in danger. Some were told the procedure was reversible. Some were told they were signing forms for something else entirely. And some were simply sterilized without being asked at all. The goal, whether stated or not, was to reduce the Native American population. It was a continuation of centuries of genocide, just in a different form. Instead of killing Native people outright, the government was trying to make sure they couldn't have children. The result was the same: the erasure of a people. By the mid-1970s, the stories were starting to come out. Activists, journalists, and lawyers were shining a light on what had been happening. The civil rights movement, the women's movement, and the disability rights movement were all pushing back against forced sterilization. People were angry. They were demanding accountability. They were demanding change. But the damage had already been done. Thousands of women had been sterilized. Thousands of families had been torn apart. And the trauma didn't just end with the surgery for many of these women. The psychological impact lasted the rest of their lives. They felt violated, betrayed, robbed of something fundamental. Some became depressed. Some became suicidal. Some felt like they had failed as women because they couldn't have children. And many of them carried the shame and the pain in silence because they didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to relive it, didn't want to be reminded of what had been taken from them. The legal landscape began to change in the 1970s. After the Relf case, new regulations were put in place to protect patients from coercive sterilization. Informed consent became a requirement. Waiting periods were introduced so that women couldn't be sterilized immediately after giving birth when they were most vulnerable. Federal funding for sterilization of minors was banned. These were important steps, but they didn't undo the harm that had already been done. And in some places, the abuse continued even after the regulations were put in place. In 2013, it was revealed that between 2006 and 2010, nearly 150 women in California prisons had been sterilized without proper approval. Doctors pressured inmates into agreeing to the procedure, telling them it would be better for them, that they couldn't afford to have more children, that they were doing them a favor. The state later admitted that the sterilizations violated medical ethics and state law, but by then it was too late. The women had already been sterilized. For decades, the survivors of forced sterilization received no acknowledgement, no apology, no compensation. But slowly, that started to change. In 2002, Virginia became the first state to formally apologize for its eugenics program. Other states followed. Oregon, California, North Carolina, and others all issued apologies. Some states, like North Carolina and Virginia, created compensation programs to pay survivors. North Carolina offered $50,000 to each living victim of its eugenics program. Virginia offered $25,000. It wasn't much, not compared to the harm that had been done, but it was something. It was an acknowledgement that what had happened was wrong. Elaine Riddick, the woman who was sterilized at 14, became one of the most vocal advocates for survivors. She testified before state legislatures. She spoke at public hearings. She fought for years to get North Carolina to acknowledge what it had done and to compensate the victims. And in 2013, North Carolina finally passed a law to pay reparations. Elaine received her check in 2014, more than 40 years after she had been sterilized. She said it wasn't about the money. It was about being heard. It was about the state finally admitting that it had done something unforgivable. But not every survivor lived to see that day. Many of the women who had been sterilized died before they ever got an apology. Many died without ever telling anyone what had been done to them, and many more were never identified, never counted, never acknowledged, because their sterilizations were never officially recorded. They disappeared into the cracks of history, forgotten by a system that never valued them in the first place. So why does this matter today? Why is it important to tell this story now, decades after most of these sterilizations took place? Because the legacy of forced sterilization is still with us. It's in the way Black women and women of color are treated in the healthcare system today. It's in the way doctors dismiss their pain, ignore their concerns, and make decisions about their bodies without their input. It's in the racial disparities, in maternal mortality, in the fact that Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related complications than white women, even when they have the same level of education and income. The history of forced sterilization is also a reminder of what happens when we devalue certain lives. When we decide that some people are worth more than others. When we let prejudice and fear shape policy, it's a reminder that eugenics didn't end in the 1970s. It just changed forms. Today, we see echoes of it in debates over reproductive rights, in policies that punish poor women for having children, in the way disabled people are still sometimes pressured into sterilization or abortion. And it's a reminder that informed consent, bodily autonomy, and human dignity are not guaranteed. They have to be fought for. They have to be protected. Because history shows us that when we're not vigilant, when we look the other way, when we let systems operate without accountability, the most vulnerable people pay the price. The women who were sterilized in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s didn't ask for this story to be hidden. They wanted it told. They wanted people to know what had been done to them. They wanted to make sure it never happened again, so we owe it to them to remember, to honor their stories, to make sure that this dark chapter of American history is never forgotten. Because if we forget, we risk repeating it. And we cannot let that happen. The Mississippi appendectomy, the stolen futures, the women who trusted doctors and were betrayed, the girls who went into clinics and came out unable to ever become mothers. This is their story. This is America's story. And it's a story we need to keep telling until everyone knows, until everyone understands, and until we finally reckon with what was done. You can click in these other videos if you like this one. Don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it and subscribe to the channel for more history documentaries.